We'll get started in about 1 minute, just to give everyone a chance to get on.
Hello, test.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on the impact of COVID-19 on rural economies. This is hosted by the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. If you are on this call, because it is meeting format, we do ask that you please mute your microphone during the session. And the only people that should be unmuting their microphone will be the speakers. If you have questions as we're going along, the chat has been enabled for this session, and you can put in questions for the speakers. And at the end of the session, we will try to address as many of the questions as we can. But the way the format is going to work is we're going to have an introduction by our discussant, Andrew Dumont from the Federal Reserve, and then we'll go forward with the 3 papers. Then we'll have a discussion by Andrew again, and then we'll open it up as time permits for additional discussion. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute my own microphone. Just a reminder to panelists that I will be keeping track of time and giving you some alerts as to kind of where you are in your time in the chat. And with that, we'll get started. Thank you, Andrew, for being willing to be with us today.
Good, thanks so much. Thank you, Heather and Dawn and the authors for inviting me to be a part of this session today. I'm just going to take a moment here to open up and share a presentation that I'm going to use for my opening remarks. So bear with me for just a moment here while I get that all squared away. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. And I got the technology right. So again, just thanks everybody for allowing me to be a part of this session today. Just my boilerplate disclaimer, everything I'm going to present here are my own interpretations of the data, do not necessarily represent the views of my colleagues in the Federal Reserve System. So appreciate that. No need to go tweet out, you know, the Fed said this or that, because it's just me. So I just wanted to go ahead and present some data to help contextualize some of the paper's findings. This is all about how the pandemic has affected rural economies. So I thought just setting some groundwork would be helpful leading into to the authors' discussions of their papers. So while I'm sure many of us are intimately familiar with these data by now, I think they're worth briefly going over. So first, some health indicators. So these data that I'll present are through December 21st, so just prior to the holiday season we went out for. And so what you'll see on this slide is that this is case rates, so infection rates at the county level, classified as either metro or non-metro, using the standard OMB classifications for the most recent time period, I think 2020. So while metro areas were hit hardest by the pandemic early on, infection rates per capita in non-metro areas surpassed those in metro areas in late October. You can see that in the bottom left-hand graph there. Similarly, as with infections, mortality rates were highest in metro areas early on, but mortality rates in non-metro areas have since surpassed those in metro areas in early December. So this is looking at metro and non-metro infection and mortality rates for all counties, as well as those that are majority minority and persistent poverty. And there's a bit going on here, and I'm happy to send these to anybody that are interested in having them. Just throw your information in the chat. But as you can see here, infection rates in majority minority areas, metro areas, sorry, are in fact lower than they are in metro counties that are not majority minority. But mortality rates are higher in majority minority and persistent poverty counties in both metro and non-metro areas. And in fact, infection rates for non-metro minority, majority minority counties are substantially higher than the non-majority minority counties as well. So here we're looking at infection and mortality rates by industry, again, for both metro and non-metro areas. And many of us will probably be familiar that both from an economic standpoint as well as a health standpoint, recreation-dependent communities were initially hard hit by the pandemic. But however, at this point, at least from a health standpoint, are some of the least affected areas nationwide. In contrast, farming-dependent communities initially were some of the least affected counties from a health standpoint and are now some of the hardest hit from a health standpoint, both in metro and non-metro areas. Now moving on to unemployment rates, the focus of some of the papers here. There was a huge spike in unemployment in April, as we're all familiar with subsequent improvements through the summer and early fall as restrictions were lifted. Now, there were significant differences between metro and non-metro areas, with metro areas having much larger increases in April and a slower recovery since then. And in the bottom table, you can see that workers of color have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic-induced layoffs, more so than white workers, and that Black workers have had a particularly shallow recovery relative to workers of other races and ethnicities. Now, still, there have been vast differences between non-metro areas, both at peak unemployment and in recovery. So this table here shows the top and bottom 5 non-metro counties by unemployment rate in April of 2020. So many recreation-dependent non-metro areas were hard hit early on in the pandemic, as I mentioned, including, interestingly, many counties in Michigan, which actually occupied 20 of the top 25 non-metro counties with respect to the peak unemployment rate in April. However, most non-metro Michigan counties have recovered strongly since April, while others like Kauai, Hawaii have remained significantly impacted through October, with still unemployment rate close to 20% in October, where many of these other areas had experienced significant recoveries. So even while non-metro areas as a whole were relatively less affected than metro, that was not universally true. So again, recreation-dependent counties, as I mentioned, were hard hit early on, but have had a stronger, relatively strong recovery. While manufacturing industries were also sort of felt very acute employment effects, but have recovered well since April as well. So last few on the employment side, persistent poverty counties and both metro and non-metro counties actually saw lower increases in unemployment at the peak in April than those that were not persistent poverty counties. However, they began with higher baseline unemployment rates and have been much slower to recover since then. And this has been the same with majority minority counties, where they experienced slightly lower spikes in unemployment in April, but have been slower to recover since that time. Now we're moving on to some unique data that I have here. And this is from a survey that the Federal Reserve's Community Development Function has fielded 4 times about every 8 weeks since early April. I call it the Community Impact Survey. And it surveys community-based organizations across the country to find out the level and type of economic impact they're seeing in their communities, among other things. And so this, the individual bars here are the different survey rounds. So going from left to right, April, June, August, and October, and are bucketed by the types of communities that the respondents reported serving. So this is self-reported. We asked what types of communities do you primarily serve, and they could pick rural, suburban, urban, or any combination of those. And so this is bucketed by those types of communities that they reported serving. And you can see that rural respondents have reported steadily less economic disruption each survey round from April through October. However, the level of economic disruption reported by urban respondents has not declined virtually at all. And so the segments of the bars going from bottom to top are no or minimal disruption, some disruption but manageable, significant or unknown, with significant being that gray bar. And so you can see the gray bar getting smaller and smaller for rural and staying essentially the same size for urban serving respondents. Moving on here, this is survey respondents were asked how quickly they expected their community to recover from the pandemic. And again, it's the survey rounds bucketed by types of community served. And sort of the lowest bar here is less than 6 months, then 6 to 12 months, more than 12 months or unknown. And again, you can see that rural serving respondents have consistently expected a quicker economic recovery than urban serving respondents. This is a gap that has widened over time. And lastly, in my last 10 seconds or so here, this is looking at the top reported impact by type of community served. So respondents were asked, what is the top impact of the pandemic on the communities you serve? And there have been persistent differences between rural respondents and respondents serving other communities, particularly urban serving respondents, in terms of what they chose as their top impact. This right here is the response to the October survey round, but it has persisted from the June, August, and October surveys, the 3 in which we asked this question, whereby rural respondents have been much more likely to report business-related effects as the top impact in their community, while urban serving respondents are more likely to report employment-related effects. And as a side note, rural respondents have been much more likely to report education as a top impact in their community than urban serving respondents, which could potentially be due to lower levels of connectivity having more adverse impact in rural areas than urban areas. And so that is what I wanted to cover, just to sort of lay the foundation for the presentations of the papers to come. And hope that was informative, and look forward to hearing the papers.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very useful, and it's nice to see some fresh data that maybe many of us haven't seen, and get more of a context about the papers that we're about to talk about. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Steve Deller to go ahead and start sharing his screen. And Steve is going to be presenting a paper on what does COVID-19 tell us about the digital divide.
Thank you, Heather. And while I go through and get started here, there we go. My role as an extension specialist, I spent a lot of time talking to the media in Wisconsin, and it's been, what's the economic impact of COVID? And one of the questions is that tends to come around again and again is this notion that COVID has created structural changes to the economy. And my general response is that no, there is no structural change. This is something that we'll get through, and once COVID, the pandemic is over, the economy will be back to kind of where it was. But there is something that, as this thing drags out, that we're starting to think, well, maybe there might be a structural change, particularly as it pertains to rural communities. One of the the primary thing, and it's starting to get a fair amount of media attention now, is the idea that telecommuting or remote working is actually a viable business opportunity here. There's a growing number of businesses that have shifted to remote telecommuting, and they're realizing that it's working. And that it is a viable strategy. Now, this creates an opportunity here, and there's been some estimates that you could see a shift to rural commuting of 14 to 23 million Americans planning to relocate because they can telecommute. You also see local governments, state governments that are looking at promoting telecommuting to achieve certain types of social objectives, if you will. Could be downgrading congestion. Maine is actually looking at it from a perspective of global warming. But now there could be, if there is a shift here, there could be serious losers here. For example, communities that rely on a lot of large office space for their economic activity could be at a disadvantage here. The Bank of Korea, for example, is expressing concern that a lot of the office space in Seoul could be, there could be a surplus. So what could be a benefit for rural areas could actually be a hindrance to some urban areas that are more dependent on office type workers. So if there is a structural shift, this could be it, this growth in the amount of telecommuting. Now for rural areas, this could be an opportunity. And this is something that we wanted to explore in this particular study. Now, the idea of telecommuting or remote working was first described by an engineer working for NASA back in 1973. Essentially what they were doing is that they found that they could actually pull together a lot of engineers working on the Apollo missions, but they didn't need to be physically located in the same place. They could essentially kind of share information back and forth. Indeed, this kind of sharing of information was one of the driving factors behind the development of the internet. It was to actually kind of facilitate this type of remote working in NASA and the Department of Defense. By the mid-1990s, there were thousands of federal government employees that were working from home. You actually saw some large companies, Controlled Data Corporation and IBM, that were working on actually trying to access computer programmers that were in high demand but in short supply. And the idea was that, hey, you could work for us and be a computer programmer, but you didn't need to actually commute into the offices. Now, one of the challenges that we've got is that the definite telecommuting has been described different ways in the literature: distributive work, flexible work arrangements, telework, virtual work. And it's a matter of kind of definition of what do we mean here by telecommuting. One of the problems that we've got, that Heather and I found in this initial analysis, is that do we classify people who operate a home-based business the same as an employee for a firm that's working from home? Are they basically the same thing? From a rural development perspective, it's not. There's not much of a difference here in terms of creating economic opportunities for rural areas, but it's difficult to analyze rigorously um, kind of the patterns in the data and inform policy if we have a hard time coming up with an acceptable definition of what it is we're looking at. Okay, the bulk of the literature that's available on telecommuting, and when I started digging into this, when Heather and I started digging into this, we were both pleasantly surprised that there's actually a lot of work out there related to telecommuting. But it kind of falls into three categories. One is the well-being of the telecommuter. Um, is this helpful for the telecommuter? Worker productivity, and then issues related to human resource management. A lot of the literature is really basically said, if you're going to have telecommuter workers, how do you manage them? Now, the problem is that it's really difficult to draw generalizations from this literature, on any one of these three topic areas, because the results vary significantly across occupation, age, experience, education, even family composition of the worker, as well as across business organizational structures. The problem that we've got here is that we're kind of lumping together a single computer engineer, who's single, working from home in Austin, Texas, is different from a bookkeeper with small children working from home in Western Kansas. But the way that we're measuring this kind of stuff with this initial analysis is that we're lumping those together. Okay, so has COVID created a structural change related to telecommuting? That's the question that we're really trying to ask here. Is this the forecast here, or the estimate that we're going to see a spike in the number of people that are telecommuting? And is that, again, an opportunity for rural areas? So the way that we're trying to look at this is that we're trying to look at three interrelated areas here. The one is, what's happening to telecommuting? How do we define it? How do we measure it? Is, from a rural development perspective, amenities and quality of life, how does that play in? We have a lot of high amenity rural communities in Wisconsin and West Virginia that are trying to attract telecommuters. I mean, they've before the pandemic, they've been trying to promote telecommuters and promote a quality of life that's based on natural amenities. Now the problem is that broadband a necessary condition here for this? And this is where we really kind of start looking at it, is this access to broadband. So that's kind of the interplay between these three things is what we're trying to look at. So this is an exploratory analysis. We used data from the American Community Survey. We used the PUMS data from 2018 and 2019. We also used the 2018 5-year averages for US counties. The 2019 just came out, but we're using the 2018 5-year average for the county. So we're looking at micro data through the PUMS and then county level data through that. With the PUMS, we do some simple subsample equivalency testing. And then with the county data, we do some more parallel subsample along with some simple regression analysis. This is just some descriptive work that's in the paper talking about the percent of people that actually are working at home. And you can see kind of a large number there in the northern Great Plains. A lot of that's farming. A lot of that's ranching. And when you get out of these Great Plains, that's the only employment opportunity, or the only employment really is in these kind of occupations. You can see some higher amenity areas, like you get up into New England, you start to see it. Upper Midwest, you start to see it a little bit. When you get on the Pacific Northwest, you start to see it. But what we want to do then is we want to see how does this broadband play into this. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out here, we've got different measures of broadband here to kind of as a robustness check. And I won't waste your time talking about those differences. But the one area that kind of pops out is look at the Mississippi Delta region, Alabama, Mississippi, and that region. So you see low levels of working from home and you see low levels of access to broadband in these areas. Is that a coincidence, or is there something there that we can actually try to start to look at? Now, one of the things that is the work that we're doing on rural areas is that there's a real digital divide here, and this is something that is not really unknown. It's kind of the argument that there's a gap in the last mile of broadband access. It's just really expensive to invest that last mile when you have really low population densities. A lot of folks do have access to broadband, but it's cellular. They're using their cell phone or they're using satellite technology. These technologies, satellite and cellular, are really kind of poor second best to having a hardwire cable coming into your house or into your business. But you do see that there's rural areas that are at a disadvantage there when it comes to not having internet. The other problem is that it's not just a population density issue, it's also an income issue. When you look at the percent of households that have less than $20,000 of income that do not have internet access, you're looking at 50% of the population that do not have access. Even if the house is wired, even if the apartment complex is wired for internet, $40 a month, which is a basic plan, is simply too expensive for a lot of low income people. So it's not just a physical infrastructure problem, it's also a cost affordability problem. And this is drawn out when you start looking at rural areas. So if rural areas, high amenity rural areas, are trying to promote telecommuters, are they kind of do they hit a wall before they even get started related to not having broadband? So one of the things that we started to do is to look at some of the PUMS data related to do you have access? Do you work at home? Yes or no? And do you have access to the internet? You can see that there's a little bit of a difference here. If you look at that last column there on the access, no, the folks that work at home, only 3% do not have access to the internet at home. Those that do not work at home, 7.7%. It appears as though having access to the internet is kind of it looks like it might be necessary for being able to work at home. We also kind of broke it out in a little bit different ways of looking at, not just cellular phones or satellites, but do you actually have cable, fiber, or DSL? The pattern still holds, but it's a little bit a smaller percent that work at home, almost 11% do not have that type of broadband. Okay. Now, one of the things with the PUMS data that we wanted to get at is this idea of occupations and the percent that work at home. You do see a large kind of pattern here that seems to be kind of fits with expectations. Writers and authors, a lot of those folks work from home, travel agents, residential advisors. Heather and I kind of scratch our head on what that is exactly. Sales engineers, web developers, management analysts, editors, medical record specialists. You can see that these kind of occupations are conducive to telecommuting. Working from home and telecommuting. Now, the problem is that some of these might be that's where their home-based business is operating. Okay, so again, it's a definitional issue. I think from a policy perspective, we don't really care whether they're telecommuting, working for a business and work remotely, or they're running their own business. Now, one of the things we wanted to break out here is to kind of look at these differences across metro, non-metro that are adjacent to a metro, and then the remote, to see if there's a pattern here in sense that people that are telecommuting, do they want to be next to a large urban area? We start to see a little bit of a pattern in terms of access to broadband at the FCC definition there. This data doesn't really seem to be supporting what we want. Notice that remote rural, the higher percentage of working from home have the lowest access to broadband. This kind of casts cold water on our central hypothesis. So this particular slide is kind of saying, maybe there isn't a connection there between broadband and working from home. Okay, this is a simple set of correlations, simple regression models. You could call them scatter plots, if you will, almost across the board. There's a positive relationship between having access to broadband and working from home. The only one that's negative is access to broadband of the 25.3. That's the FCC data. That seems to not play out. We discount the FCC data because there's all sorts of problems with it. And I won't take the time to go into that, but this seems to be suggesting that maybe there is something there between broadband access and working from home. We ran a more simple model, more regression model. We wanted to bring in some control variables for the percent that are self-employed, percent regional or occasional. That's kind of used housing. That's kind of a measure of amenities. An occupation measure. We got some amenity measures there. We also got distance to metro areas there. We've got 3 measures of broadband that we're using. We run the model for all counties, then for metro counties, and then non-metro adjacent, and then non-metro non-adjacent or remote. Here's our table of results, and I want to spend the rest of the time going through each and every one of these in excruciating detail. No, I won't do that to you. You can look at this at your leisure, but this is the general pattern that we find. The darker the green, it tends to be positive and significant, and red is negative, significant, and you can see the guide there. Generally, percent self-employed, more people tend to work at home. Seasonal or occasional use housing, that's our measure of recreational housing. Amenities, positive, significant. Management of these kind of footloose occupations that can remote work, that's positive and significant. January temperature, oddly negative. January sunny days, positive, but not consistently significant. July humidity, you can start to see these amenity things start to come into play, except for January temperature. Water area, that one's, I think we need to spend a little bit more time on that. That incremental distance, that didn't really come in, and that's only for the really remote ones. Okay, we broke it out, access to broadband for all counties, metro, adjacent, and remote. Metro, we do see that there is a positive relationship there. Adjacent, nothing is significant, and remote, it's actually negative. This latter result is really kind of disappointing. Better access to broadband lowers the share of workers that work from home. That's not what we were expecting. That's the exact opposite. We did try to see if there's some spatial variation here. So we used a geographically weighted regression result. We do find that there is significant spatial variation here in the underlying relationship. But it's, again, we're exploring we're at exploratory stages right now. So this is kind of where we left scratching our head, and this is where we're hoping for some feedback. Is the results are mixed, they're inconsistent, and not what we expected. Is our measure from the American Community Survey, work from home, too gross of a measure for what we're trying to measure? Is it simply that particular measure of quote unquote telecommuting, it's just there's too many problems with that measure? Are the broadband measures too gross to capture what we want? This is something that those of us that have been working on rural broadband, our measures of broadband access are really not very good. Are there complicating underlying spatial relationships that we're missing? That's kind of the GWR. We're ignoring spatial spillovers and all that type of stuff. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you, Steve. And as I said at the beginning, we're going to go through all 3 papers first, and then we're going to open it to Andrew for some discussion, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the participants if you have questions. You can put things in the chat as you think of them, or you can just wait until the end. So with that, we'll go on to our next speaker, Philip Watson from University of Idaho. Phil, if you want to start sharing your screen, make sure everything's working, and then we'll let you get going on the impacts of COVID-19 on liquor purchases.
All right, is that sharing?
Yep.
All right, great.
And
All right, well,
again,
thank you, everybody. We'll switch to talking about liquor. It's a little early out here in the Pacific, but maybe where some of you are, it's time to start thinking about a drink. I will acknowledge my co-authors here, Jason Winfrey, also here at the University of Idaho, Joe McCluskey and Ron Middlehammer, both at Washington State University. I should also say, too, that this was originally going to be looking at both liquor and food. Unfortunately, our scanner data got delayed, so we'll just look at liquor. But I'm going to make a case that hopefully it might have broader insights. So let's talk about some of the introduction here. So there's been a lot of work already kind of looking at how COVID has affected food, I guess consumer behavior in general, food specifically. We've seen some preliminary research on fruit and vegetable prices being affected by COVID, meat production, and a lot of really interesting work on kind of the supply chain disruptions. There's also been some kind of preliminary research that has indicated that there's been a shift towards more comfort foods, which maybe liquor is a comfort food. So we've seen some preliminary research on that. There's also been some research that says that urban and rural areas have been affected differently, and we've seen some of that already today. And there's been some, I guess lastly, kind of related to this, some early indications that liquor consumption has increased due to COVID. However, I guess what I would say is that a lot of that preliminary research was kind of survey based, kind of asking people about their liquor consumption. So this paper hopefully will add some insight, because we're going to be using kind of revealed data. We have a highly detailed and somewhat novel data set that has both retail and wholesale. So I'll talk about the data in more detail here in a second, but it has all the sales to both bars and restaurants and to consumers. So we can kind of look at both sides of those. And we have it going back to 2007 all the way through, we have it through August of 2020. So to kind of maybe make a case that liquor kind of followed a broader trend. This is some work out of this Opportunity Insights. Raj Chetty was part of this. So this is just looking at, so that blue line is looking at grocery stores, food purchase at grocery store expenditures. That red line is looking at expenditures at hotels and restaurants. So this is a national trend. You see that big spike there in March in grocery store expenditures. That was the run on toilet paper, all the wheat and the flour and things like that. And then correspondingly to a dramatic drop in hotel and restaurant expenditures. Now that's nationally. If you kind of switch to Idaho, whoop, sorry, I guess my hair is already doing automatic move forward. So there's national, there's Idaho. So it follows a fairly similar trend. If you look at kind of national to Idaho, even though Idaho closed down, had cases later than the nation as a whole, we saw that again, that initial spike there around the same time and drop. So how does that relate to liquor? Well, this is kind of, I have the data going all the way back to 2007. This is kind of a little snapshot there, starting in January of 2018 and looking at it through August of 2020. And interestingly enough, in fact, this graph pretty much is the entire paper. We'll go on, but we could stop here. So if you see here that there's a spike in December every year. And if you go, if I had it back here, you'd always see it's a very consistent spike in December. It drops to January. Dry January is a thing, I guess. Then you see even a bigger drop in February. Then March, hey, what happens in March? I don't know. I guess we're drinking Jameson in March. It spikes up a little bit, it goes down again in April. And then you start to see this kind of ramp up in the summer, spiking in July and August, and then back down again to September, where then it ramps back up again to the holidays where it peaks in December. Very consistent pattern. We'll look at the whole data set here in a second. But then you see January 2020, and January looked very similar to January all the time. Okay, January looked like January. February, okay, well, it kind of went up a little bit, but still not a big deal. And holy hell, the wheels came off, and March happens, and we see this enormous spike, basically above December levels of consumer spending on liquor. Now, what happened on the wholesale side? And these are sales to bars and restaurants. They're much more stable, have some seasonal variability, but you saw here, this is when we had shutdowns of restaurants, to going down to near zero levels. So this pattern of liquor to the retail and to the kind of bar and restaurant side tracks very, very nicely with kind of overall consumption at retail and at restaurant spending. So a little bit more about our data. So this comes from the state of Idaho. Idaho is one of 7 states that all liquor must go through, it must be intermediated by a state-run or at least state licensed liquor store. And I don't know how, actually, I don't know how common this is, but it's not just retail sales that have to go through the liquor stores. Every single bottle of liquor that is opened in the state of Idaho has to have been purchased in a state-run liquor store, and that includes the bars and restaurants. So they all have to get their liquor through that, so it gets all tracked. So we have in our data set, we have both sales to wholesale to bars and restaurants and sales to retail to consumers. Interestingly enough, I've done some other research looking at kind of state spillover effects, and pretty much Idaho is the cheapest place to buy liquor in the Pacific Northwest. So there's very little spillover from Idahoans going to Washington or Oregon or Utah, but there are potentially spillovers the other way. Washingtonians, Oregonians coming to Idaho to buy liquor. So we kind of think that our data set represents kind of a census of all liquor purchased and consumed in Idaho. So we have our data, and I'll show you here in a second. Our data is a specific bottle. So the data set tracks a specific bottle, gets an ID code, and we get the number of those bottles sold by store by month from January 2007 through August of 2020. So here's kind of the header of our data. As you can see here, we kind of have this item ID, and that's linked to this item description, which is a specific type of liquor. So, it's not just, it's not highly aggregated. It's very specific. So this Wild Turkey 101 that's 1.75 liters. That would have a specific item number. The location ID is a store. Okay, we have a month, a year. We have number of sales to retail, and then this discount is the wholesale. So it also gives us kind of the city and the county where that transaction takes place, where that store is basically. The metric is kind of, that's in milliliters. So 1,000 would be a liter. The proof, so the percent alcohol of the bottle. This PLIN ID, which we'll talk about more in a second here, that's kind of a bigger type. So we actually are going to roll up all of our sales to the type, this PLIN ID here in a second. And then it gives you the price, both the retail and the wholesale price paid for that bottle. But we're going to turn these all into kind of on a per liter basis, but we have all the information we need for that. We have number of bottles and the metrics, so we can turn that into liters to make them all comparable. Here is kind of, it's small, but here is kind of what that Plin ID looks like. So it's still fairly disaggregated. You know, we have single malt Scotch versus kind of blended Scotch. We have, you know, different kinds of schnapps and tequilas. So it still gives us a pretty broad view of what kind of liquor is being sold. One of the reasons we did this is that the data set doesn't include zero sales. So if there's not a zero, if no specific bottle is sold at a given store in a given month, it won't give us a zero. It just won't, it's not in our data set. So we have some truncation problems, which we'll again talk about. So we kind of rolled it up to these kind of categories to, in some way, alleviate some of that problem, although it doesn't get rid of that problem completely, because I guess people aren't drinking cinnamon schnapps in August. Go figure. Okay, so rural versus urban is another kind of big part of this. While Idaho is obviously a fairly rural state, there are a couple of relatively urban areas. Both Boise and Coeur d'Alene are considered kind of metro areas. Coeur d'Alene is connected to Spokane, Washington. So basically, we have 3 counties which we are calling our urban counties. That's Ada County, Canyon County, and Kootenai County. Interestingly enough, those 3 counties represent basically 50% of the state population. So those are going to be, when we talk about kind of urban rural, we're going to be talking about those 3 counties versus the rest of the state. All right, so here's kind of a more detailed look at our liquor sales. So as you can see here, there's that month, so that we have a month axis and a year axis. So you can see again that there's definitely a spike there in December, and that's very consistent every year. There are some spikes in summer and kind of low points there in January, February. And that's, again, very consistent. You'll see that the surface is pretty consistent. But you'll notice that there is an overall increasing trend in liquor consumption, both because of population growth and because of actual increases in consumption. So we would want to be able to account for that. But you again see this giant spike there when you get to 2020 in those months of March, April, May, June. Conversely, looking at kind of what is the discount or the wholesale or the bars and restaurant sales, it's not nearly as, there's not as much of an upward trend. There is a slight one. But again, you see a giant precipitous fall there in March of 2020. And less seasonal, but still some seasonality in it. So what can we say about kind of just looking at the data before we jump into an econometric model? So if we look at kind of the total liters sold between March and August, we can look at it as total, as retail, and as wholesale. We can see here that they're all above what that number would have been in, sorry, the total and the retail are above what they were in 2019 over that same time period. In fact, they're up 26% in retail sense, but they're down 41% in terms of wholesale sales for an overall effect of about 14.7%. And that number 14.7 is about in the range of what other people have kind of said what the increase in consumption has been. However, you notice there was an overall kind of autoregressive time trend here. And basically retail liquor sales from 2007 through 2019 had been growing at an average rate of about 6%. So when you account for that, instead of having a 27% increase, it's more like a 19% increase. However, the sales at bars and restaurants, or the wholesale sales, had been growing at about a 2% clip. So when you account for that, the drop was even more so. It was at about a 42% decrease. So that's kind of the overarching what happened. Liquor sales went up, I guess. They went up in retail, down in wholesale, but there was still an overall about 9% increase in liquor sales in the state. So well, because we're economists and we always have to run a regression, but also to kind of maybe add some deeper insights into this, we kind of have a model here. Sorry, that resolution is a little low, but basically we're going to run 9 separate regressions. Okay, we're gonna have separate models for a statewide model. Then we're gonna have a model for urban and rural, and we're gonna have models that kind of have total liquor. We're also gonna separate out retail sales and then wholesale sales. Okay, so that gives us kind of 9 total models, and we're gonna look at kind of the quantity of sales in liters at store S of liquor type L in time T. Okay. And that's a month, any given month. Okay, where we have P is the real price per liter of the liquor. A is the percent alcohol. B is beer, the CPI for beer, and W is the CPI for wine. We wanted to have a substitute good in our model. U is the unemployment rate in the county to give kind of an income and wealth effect. And then C are the number of new cases in each respective county. Starting, the first case in Idaho was in March of 2020. Okay, so basically U and C are kind of what we kind of are the treatments, what we think should affect kind of COVID specific effects that we want to tease out. We have a set of fixed effects as well. These Ks, we break out a specific dummy for each month in 2020 to kind of capture, is there an effect in 2020 that is not accounted for by the unemployment rate changes and the COVID cases? And that's actually going to be kind of the interesting part of this, is how much of it, the effect, is captured by actual COVID cases and unemployment rates versus how much is still in that COVID month that is not accounted for by those, which we might think as being either fear or a policy, a shutdown policy that's not related to COVID. And then we have kind of real standard fixed effect controls we have a dummy for each liquor type, each month is in January, February, March, each year, in each store. We have a store fixed effect to control for any differences spatially across the sample. Okay, so that's our model. So all variables, we log each of those variables, except for the categorical, obviously, and that those COVID cases by county. So we have a problem there, right? There's a lot of zeros, especially at the beginning of back in 2007, there's a lot of zeros. So since we can't log a zero, but we still wanted kind of this elasticity type interpretation, we use, instead of a log for that, we use the inverse hyperbolic sine transformation. And the nice thing about that is it still allows for it allows us to have zeros, but still have interpret the results as an elasticity. Okay, the other problem, which I kind of touched on a little bit, is if there are no transactions for a given liquor type in a given month at a given store, okay, then no transaction is reported. We also limit our transactions to, I think we did to 20% alcohol and 0.2 liters. So we got rid of the little bottles or anything that didn't fit those criteria. So we kind of had this truncation problem. Our data is truncated at 0.2 liters. So you can't just jump into OLS. So we had to use a truncated regression, truncated at 0.2, and we used robust standard errors. Okay, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of this. Here's kind of our summary stats. Maybe the most important thing here is kind of number. We have about 800,000 observations once we did all those transformations over 12 months. So how many there are in a year? And then we go over 14 years. We have about 186 stores in the state of Idaho, and there are 58 unique liquor types. So kind of just looking at kind of COVID in Idaho from March through September, which is kind of what our data set well, the first cases were in March, and our data set kind of goes through August and September. We had about 42,549 cases. And the nice thing about it, that time period between urban and rural, it's a fairly good split. About 57% of the cases were in urban areas, 43% of the cases were in our rural areas. Again, we define that as those 3 counties are the urban counties, everything else is rural. So the population and the total amount of liquor sold is also roughly 50-50 between the urban and rural. So we kind of have a nice split of our data set. Okay, so looking at kind of our results. And we will break these down a lot kind of by urban versus rural. So as we saw, liquor sales are certainly up overall. We will see here that the urban areas seem to be much more sensitive than rural areas to the COVID-19. We'll see that here in a sec. And that the reduction in sales in rural areas is much more influenced by non-COVID or economic, such as unemployment effects. So here's kind of the table. The only one we need to look at here right now is that if you look at this as kind of statewide, the effect of COVID is much stronger in the urban areas than it is in the rural areas. But for both of them, there's kind of these strong specific month fixed effects. So there's other things going on besides kind of the unemployment rate and the COVID cases. Although we do feel pretty good, because if you look at kind of February, it's insignificant. The p-values kind of are very insignificant, meaning that we kind of our models is controlling kind of that there was nothing interesting about February, which it shouldn't have been. So we kind of feel pretty good about that. So this is kind of the overall, but the more interesting parts are kind of when we get to the retail versus wholesale. So again, fairly same story when we look at urban versus rural and these COVID cases. Much stronger effect in the urban areas than in the rural areas, affecting liquor sales. So rural areas were much more affected by other things, whether that be a policy or fear. I'm not sure we can tease that out. I would love to hear if any ideas on that. When you get to restaurant, kind of the wholesale, interestingly enough, again, urban areas much more affected by COVID cases. That's what's predicting the change in liquor demand. In fact, when you get down here into the specific month fixed effects, they're positive, or not, typically either positive or not significant, meaning that it's really the COVID cases and the unemployment that are describing the change in liquor sales, not anything else going on in those months. Whereas that's not necessarily the case in rural areas, where liquor was affected by other effects in the state or going on. So I guess the last slide here, some substitution between bar and restaurant and at-home consumption. Even with a drop in restaurant consumption, total consumption is up by an estimated 9%. That might be a little lower than previous studies because we're kind of controlling for a couple other things. So retail was up 19%, while wholesale was down 42%. And maybe the most interesting part of this, especially related to urban and rural, is that the effects were more persistent in rural areas. Rural areas remained higher than urban areas throughout the pandemic. Rural areas seem to be more impacted by policies that were not specifically COVID-19 case related, or that could be general anxiety or anxiety about the state of the world that's picking up in those specific month fixed effects. So maybe we're finding some evidence that rural areas were subjected to urban area conditions that were not actually COVID related cases in their area. That might be the provocative part of this. We don't know. We're still trying to tease that out. So excited to hear any comments people might have on this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. And definitely we're hearing a lot of very different presentations today about the effect of COVID and sort of where we might come out of COVID when the economy does start to recover. So I am the final presenter today. So let me pull up my screen and make sure everyone can see it. Hold on. Can someone give me a heads up that you can see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Looks great.
Okay, great. It's always hard when you're the presenter to sometimes know what other people are seeing. So, okay, well, let me then go forward with my talk, and I'll just ask maybe Steve or Phil if one of you could give me an alert when I'm at 5 minutes. I think I won't take the whole time, but about 20 minutes in, I'd appreciate it. This is some joint work with Zachary Keeler, who's a PhD candidate here at WVU, and Mark Partridge from Ohio State University. And we are looking at the employment effects and business opportunities from COVID-19. Let's get my cursor back where I can keep going. So I thought that it's, and we all know what's going on, but thinking into 2021, I stumbled across a picture of this beautiful scenic coast from Portugal, which is where I was this time last year. And I thought about the things that have really changed this year. And so I think it's just important for us to take perspective of all the things that have changed in the last year. So first of all, I know it was out there, but I hadn't heard of COVID in January. Last year, this time, this conference was in person. I was in Portugal. You saw things like crowded bars and restaurants. You saw games with fans. All of this is stuff that we took for granted. And so when we're thinking about the economic effects of COVID, we really have to think about all the things that have changed. And so where are we today? Well, I don't know if anyone else saw this, but the word of the year is COVID. A word we didn't even know about 1 year ago. We are sitting here in a virtual conference. I pulled this screenshot from one of the virtual sessions for ASSA from yesterday or the day before. We aren't on vacation. There's staycations, masks, grocery delivery. Personally, I'd never gotten grocery delivery until March of last year. Many states currently have bans on indoor dining, and they just announced yesterday that the NCAA tournament is going to be the battle in the bubble in Indianapolis. So this is the world that we live in, and we need to understand what the impacts of this are on our economy. So as we all know, there's stay-at-home orders that started in March, and we basically ended up with a huge spike in unemployment, like Andrew talked about in the beginning with his remarks, and then an initial stimulus package and a new stimulus package, obviously, that was released recently. But the initial stimulus package and the $600 amount a week extra unemployment benefits, the loans to small and medium-sized businesses did potentially delay some of the economic impacts. But then as we got later in the year, many of these benefits had expired, even as the virus surged. And so, you know, we all have seen these graphs that show this big spike in unemployment and a leveling off through into November, which is where this graph ends. We also see, right, this big drop in employment, right, and this partial recovery, which is why unemployment has gone down. But these are national numbers. And so in the interest of understanding the impact of this pandemic, of these economic problems, it's really important that we start to think about the geographic variation. So partially because there was no coordinated national response or national policy, partially because of how COVID spread, hitting different places at different times, and also partially because of the economic structure of regions, not all regions were hit the same or at the same time. And so you can see from this graph, this is the April seasonally adjusted unemployment rates when unemployment rates were the highest. And you can see there's tremendous variation across space at the state level. And then we can look at a more recent map, you're looking at November 2020, and there still seems to be some significant state level regional variation that is due to all of these underlying factors. So one of the things that we know is driving this geographic variation, partially due to some research that has been done this year, is that the industry structure of places varies. And we know that there are some industries that have been very hard hit by this pandemic, including many in the hospitality sector, and as well as air transportation, some of the energy sectors. And so as of May 2019 to May 2020, looking at the change from one year to another, and I use this because our analysis is going to look at this, is going to focus on this time period. You can see that overall non-farm employment was down about 11%, and some of these industries that we knew were getting hit hard were down more than the average across the nation. We also know, Andrew talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that there's different populations have been hit differently by the pandemic, especially women, minorities, younger workers, older workers, and less educated workers, especially ones that may be in jobs where they cannot work remotely. And then, sort of loaded on top of this, or layered on top of this, is remote work in school, which has highlighted this potential sort of variation in access to broadband that Steve Deller talked about in his presentation. And while there was this Paycheck Protection Program available that was targeted at small and medium businesses, there's consistent evidence that there's still a lot of small businesses closing, and that maybe more of the funds went to larger businesses. And so when we're starting to think about the recovery, everyone's talking about the rollout of the vaccines and us getting back to a place where we don't have this current stresses on our economy. What will this mean for that recovery, and especially for rural areas? Well, one of the things we can draw upon is some recent work on resilience from the latest Great Recession. And in some work that's come out in the last couple of years, again, we find some evidence that the industrial composition of counties matters, that places with more college-educated people did better, and that more urbanized places were more resilient. So given all the discussion about urban areas getting hit harder by COVID, will this actually play out in the data when we start to look at the analysis? And will this be a good story for rural areas who maybe didn't recover as quickly as urban areas in the Great Recession? There's also some other literature from the Great Recession that talks about the impact on new business formations. And this is basically, as businesses closed, new opportunities became available, and that many of these were businesses of necessity. And yet there's some previous research that shows that even if you start a business because you don't have a job, that you can still contribute to growth, especially in distressed regions. And so this could actually be a good thing for rural areas if places that weren't doing as well are able to create new businesses as employment declines. So overall, we're sort of appealing to this literature that sort of shows that when you have a disruption to the economy and record levels of unemployment, that now you have this new opportunity to create new businesses. And how this plays out is, again, going to depend on the underlying structure of the region. So our main research objective then is to do two things. We're going to look at factors that are associated with county level employment changes in the face of COVID. So what helps certain places do better? What has meant some places did worse? And are there differences between rural and urban areas? And we're also going to examine the opportunities presented by COVID, because we know that a lot of small businesses have closed. We know that there's been this drastic change in our economy. And is this leading to new business startups? And what are the factors that are associated with places that have more new business startups than others? So the first one we're going to do is we're going to look at county level employment changes. And we have detailed industry level data through June of 2020. And we're going to examine a number of different models to sort of understand the employment effect at the local level. One is the percent change from 2019 to 2020 in that calendar month in terms of employment changes. This will help control for some seasonality in employment. We're also going to look at employment changes within 2020, starting with January and looking at the effect in March, April, May, and June. And then finally, we're going to sort of appeal to the shift share literature and think about the competitiveness effect of a county. And this would be the difference between its predicted growth based on its underlying industry structure and its actual growth from between 2019 and 2020. Again, month to month, like May 2019 to May 2020, again, to control for seasonality. We're going to look at all counties, rural and urban counties separately, and we're going to use explanatory variables that are lagged, so they're going to be from 2018 or earlier to help minimize endogeneity. And we're also going to have fixed effects in all of our models. And so just to sort of motivate this again, this is employment change from May 2019 to May 2020 at the county level. And you can see that there's tremendous variation. There are actually some counties that saw employment growth over that time period. And there are also counties that lost up to 60% of their employment. So this is a there's a lot of variation to exploit here. The second measure to look at new business activity is we're going to look at the percent change from the same week in 2019 to the same week in 2020 in the number of high propensity business applications. And these are basically businesses that have a good chance, applications that have a good chance of turning into true businesses. We're going to control for the COVID effect by using a dummy variable that's equal to 1 if the week is after the national declaration of emergency date of March 13th, but we're also going to exclude the couple weeks immediately after that, just to make sure we're not missing the timing. We're also going to pull some data that other people have used from the Opportunity Insights folks on weekly indicators such as credit card and debit card spending, number of initial unemployment insurance claims, number of job postings, percent change in small business openings. So this is this a place where a lot of businesses have recently opened and the opportunities have already been sort of taken advantage of? Or is this a place where there's still a lot of opportunities out there? Percent change in small business revenues. So this could be if places are doing well, then you might start a new business because you feel like this is a profitable place to start a business. And like what Phil was doing, we're going to control for the recent COVID cases. We're going to lag all of these by 3 weeks so that we can have some see how people are kind of reacting to these things. And in some models, we're going to control for a lot of other things about the states, which would be their demographics, their industry structure, using variables that predate this time period or from 2018. And we're going to have weekly time fixed effects as well as use BEA regions to control for other sort of things that may vary across the country. And just to sort of motivate this again, I want to show you, these are the weekly high propensity new business applications across the US. I'm using this data from the Federal Reserve Board, which I'll talk about in a second. And you can see that at the very beginning of the year, the numbers tracked each other pretty well. And then you see around week 11, which is when the national emergency declaration took place, you see this big drop in 2020, sort of continuation in 2019, and then a big jump after a few weeks that remains throughout the rest of the year. So this motivates that there does seem to be something going on after the sort of initial COVID crisis. Okay, we have a whole bunch of data, but there's kind of two main sources of data. One is we have county and state level employment data through June of 2020, some monthly, some annual, from EMSI Inc. And it has detailed industry level data as well as data on who is self-employed in 2018 and 2019. It also has data on the number of women of certain ages or people of certain ages. And so we're going to exploit all of this in terms of controls in our model. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to use this data from the Federal Reserve Board, the FRED data, on weekly high propensity business applications at the state level through November 22nd, 2020. And again, this is to try to get us farther along in the year when things might have recovered. We're going to use a bunch of demographic data from the census, county definition of metro based on the OMB 2013 definition. We're going to use some proximity to urban areas using ArcGIS, this weekly data that I already mentioned from Opportunity Insights, which comes from a whole bunch of different sources. Unemployment data sort of to control for places that were already not doing well. And again, we're going to try to exploit this natural amenities that Steve talked about earlier. And because there is some evidence that that places that voted for President Trump in 2016 seem to be less dynamic in terms of new businesses, we're going to control for that. This may also control for attitudes about the crisis itself. Okay, so in the interest of space, as I mentioned, we did all these models month to month, March to March, April to April, May to May, June to June, all these within 2020 analyses. And so I'm going to focus on a number of results that are sort of representative of the rest of the results in the interest of time. Okay, so there is a lot to see here. And so I'm just going to skip to my summary page, but I want to show you that we are controlling for self-employment share and pretty detailed industry shares to try to get at the industries that were hard hit or may have benefited from the crisis. We're also controlling for whether it's urban or not in our total model, all these other things, population density, unemployment rate, demographics like the age groups, the education levels, the racial composition, percent foreign born, broadband access, etc. Okay, and we're going to do that for the total employment, the predicted minus actual. So this is that, did they do better than predicted kind of thing? And we're going to do that as well with this within 2020 analysis. So let me just kind of summarize some of the highlights that we see. And the first is that consistent with the previous literature, more self-employment does seem to help counties. If there's more self-employment in a county pre-COVID, we see positive employment growth within 2020. So that would be the January to May models. And this might be due to the fact that self-employed were actually eligible for unemployment. And so maybe they were able to continue to sort of spend in the local economy. We also see year-to-year growth in urban counties. So for urban counties, more self-employment seems to just lead to overall higher growth. But probably most importantly, for all counties, both total, urban, and rural, we find that having more self-employed individuals pre-COVID leads to better employment outcomes than predicted using our shift share analysis. And this is sort of, again, consistent with some of the previous literature that shows that places do better when they have more self-employed. We also find that counties with higher levels of the industries hard hit by the pandemic generally are suffering employment losses in most of our models. And interestingly, despite fears that COVID would hurt urban areas, urban counties are doing better. So that urban dummy in our first model is positive and statistically significant. Although they're not necessarily doing better than predicted, it's statistically insignificant. And urban counties with more self-employed workers and better broadband are also experiencing higher employment growth. So this goes back to those results earlier from Steve, and where we saw that broadband was kind of helping urban areas more than rural areas in terms of these people working from home. Perhaps that's what we're seeing here as well. Interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, places that voted for President Trump did better. And this may be due to there was less fear about the virus. Some of the research from this year says that the employment effects from the virus are really more about people being afraid. But it also could just be that the virus hadn't yet spread to some of these areas by early summer. We also do see some evidence consistent with the research this year that more places with more women and more foreign-born workers are facing worse employment outcomes. And we know that especially for women, there is a disproportionate share of women who are taking on home burdens with remote schooling and some of the other changes that have happened in 2020. For some of the other factors, though, the picture is a lot more mixed between our models. And so there's more we need to sort of delve into. Unlike in previous recessions, we actually find that having higher educated workers is not necessarily helping counties, especially within 2020 results. So it's not necessarily that places with more highly educated workers are kind of faring better. And unlike previous recessions, places that were already struggling seem to be doing just as well as other counties. Overall, year-to-year employment changes, we saw that places with more retail were doing better. But when we look at whether they're doing better than predicted, we find that places with more retail employment are doing worse. And perhaps this is due that as retail employment sort of declines, then that sort of has bigger spillovers into the broader economy. So next we look at the changes in state high propensity new business applications from the same week in 2020 from 2019. And you can see at the top of this chart that overall, after COVID, the number is up, consistent with our graph. And we also see some evidence that places with no shutdown, which is near the bottom of the graph, had lower, which is probably not surprisingly, fewer businesses closed. And places with more COVID cases also seem to be leading to more new business applications, consistent with this idea that there's loss of businesses, there's this huge change in the structure, and now people are trying to find new opportunities. I'm not going to go over this whole thing, but the one thing I want to look at, and I'll highlight it on my final slide, is that the female employment share in 2018 is highly positive and statistically significant with more new business applications. And that is consistent with some previous literature that shows that women, when faced with having to balance work-life, different responsibilities, may decide to choose to be self-employed rather than work for someone else. So again, there's this clear post-COVID increase, and this holds up across our models. There are also fewer applications in states that never shut down and in states that voted for Trump. And perhaps this is due to the lack of shutdowns and fewer business failures, but it's also consistent with some research by Mark Partridge and a new report from the Economic Innovation Group that found that these counties just tended to be less dynamic. It also appears that entrepreneurs are looking for opportunities as they are filing for new businesses and places where people are spending more, where profits are higher, and where there were fewer new business openings. And there does seem to be a clear post-COVID effect, but not in the importance of these factors. Initial unemployment changes claims as they go up, we also see new business filings, again, perhaps entrepreneurs of necessity, but post-COVID, this benefit is partially offset. However, that could be due to the fact that they're getting these $600 additional benefits for a good portion of the time period. And finally, we find that further emphasizing the possibility of entrepreneurs of necessity, that in places with more of the hard-hit industries pre-COVID, such as air transportation and mining, we are seeing more new business applications. And again, I pointed out this result related to women, that there is an increase in business applications when you have more employed women prior to the crisis. So where does this leave us? Well, hopefully I've demonstrated that there is this huge heterogeneous effect of COVID across the US. While we know it has had some negative effects on employment, it has led to closing of businesses, it also opens up opportunities for new businesses. And so what we're trying to do is contribute to our understanding of these effects and how they may play out over the coming year, to help us sort of think about how to predict the fallout also of future economic shocks. So as we move forward, I'm looking forward to the discussion today as we refine our methodology to help us understand these effects. And thank you for your time. I think I'm right on time, or at least close. I've been getting some notices. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew, who's going to lead off the discussion. Let me just get my cursor to work here. Okay, Andrew, you're up.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just go ahead and share my screen here, bouncing between PowerPoints. All right. Oh, I got something in my way. Okay. All right, here we go. We're on. We're moving and shaking. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And I think I turned my video off, so I apologize about that. I can't figure out how to get back to that now. Ah, here we go. These technologies, sometimes they're our friends, but not always. Also, well, again, I'll just throw my disclaimer on the screen because, that's a thing that we do at the Fed. But these are all my opinions on these papers. I think they were all great papers. I just want to start out by saying that I think these are all great contributions to our understanding of how this pandemic has affected the economy in different regions and different rural and really urban communities. I think you guys did a great job, and they're all stellar work. So congratulations on your contributions. So in the interest of time, I want to create some space for others that are on this that I know have interesting questions to ask. So I'll focus really just on some of my recommendations and reflections on the papers, and not comment too much on sort of raising the findings again. Everybody just heard those, so they don't need me to reiterate those. And all of this within the context, again, of that I thought these were great. So just things for y'all to think about. Starting with the paper on the digital divide. One recommendation for y'all to think about, you note in the paper, and I think in your presentation, about this inability to distinguish between home-based businesses and employees. You may be familiar with it, but there was a paper by Gallardo and Whitaker in 2018, 21st Century Economic Development, Telework and its Impact on Local Income. And in that paper, they do break these two groups down, as well as strip out those working in the agricultural industry, which I think were a couple of areas where, especially in the Midwest, there was most opportunity for sort of self-employed farmers and ranchers to sort of muddy the findings a little bit. So if you are familiar with that paper or you're not, just recommend maybe going and checking that out and jumping on the phone with the two of them and figuring out what their methodology was and whether that's something that you'd be able to apply to your paper in order to get at really that concept that you're trying to get at about this attracting telecommuters. So it's just a recommendation for you to think about. So reflections on the paper, and I sort of was modifying this presentation while I was listening, but I was modifying it, turns out, on a different computer because I got two going on here. So I'm going to note some stuff that isn't on the presentation on screen here. But you mentioned that natural amenities are positively correlated with working from home. And that's great. for those places that have great natural amenities. Unfortunately, there's not really much that a community can do about that because they either have natural amenities or they don't. So what would be interesting is, would there be a way to assess amenities that communities have control over and have those in the model? So things like thriving arts and culture ecosystem, things that you can invest in and support and sort of promote in your community that you have control over that might be able to attract people that aren't the temperature in January, which you really can't do anything about. And so thinking about whether there are measures of those place-based amenities that communities do have control over that may be able to attract people. And are those things that are actually correlated with attracting telecommuters? So that would be an interesting thing to maybe add to the model and figure out whether it is related to the level of work from home in a community. In addition, sort of another reflection is, I thought it was interesting these tables 2A and 2B, which in the paper note that broadband is not necessarily a precondition to working from home, because there are a fairly sizable number of households where somebody is working from home and does not have access to broadband or other internet, but it does play some role. And I think this is important because it implies that communities can support local economic development and job creation through home-based work even without broadband. And I think that's important. So, so communities need not wait for broadband to support local entrepreneurs. There are things that they can do now, even in the absence of that. But attracting certain occupations will require investments in broadband. So they can do things now, but neither should they neglect these important future-oriented investments. So it's sort of a both-and situation, where don't just wait for broadband to support your community and sort of figure out how to promote home-based work, but don't think that you can just rely on that and move forward and that you're going to be okay. So, so I thought that was an important point that sort of gives people hope that they can do something now while recognizing that they really need to be thinking about the future and making those investments that are future-oriented. Again, the finding that broadband access may in fact decrease the rate of people working from home in remote rural communities is certainly counterintuitive and I think should be explored. Just a couple of possible explanations, and I was just making these up, so they're things that you'd certainly want to explore in a more rigorous way, but it's possible that increased broadband access attracts higher paying non-home work businesses that pull existing home workers into location-based occupations. So this may be more important a factor in remote areas than in metro or metro adjacent areas, because the presence of or absence of broadband may be more stark in remote rural areas and more important in remote rural areas. So sort of its presence or not is more relevant in these remote areas and could be more of a deciding factor between potentially higher paying employer as opposed to home work-based businesses that could be pushing folks from home-based work into, like I said, establishment-based work, where you would see maybe this counterintuitive finding where increases in broadband results in fewer people working from home. Second could be, and so maybe if you can figure out a way to sort of explore that question would be interesting. And another is there may be systematic differences in the characteristics of people who choose to live in remote rural areas and want to work from home, and those that chose to live in remote rural areas and choose not to work from home, that is somehow correlated to the level of an area's access to broadband. So maybe people who live in places with lower levels of broadband are more likely to want to work from home or be self-employed than those who live in places with higher levels of broadband access in important ways that could be driving this finding. So, so say there's higher levels of broadband access may attract folks that may not be interested in working from home. Maybe they're moving there and want to work for a higher paying employer that is in the area or something along those lines. So there could just be correlations between the sort of people that locate in different areas and their propensity to work from home or not. It could drive this. Again, you'd have to try to think about who those people are, who are drawn to different areas, if there's a way to sort of proxy that or measure that in order to get these sort of systematic differences into the model in some way to explain that. But something to explore as a possible explanation. So again, a great paper, a few things to think about if you want to take it a little bit further, explore some of these findings. So the next paper on liquor consumption changes from COVID-19. Just some recommendations, questions that I had related to this after reading the paper. I thought it was really interesting, the data that you had. If it's possible to get daily sales data from the state, I think it would be really interesting and worthwhile to do more fine-tuned analysis, because we know that these activity restrictions, one day they're not there and then the next day they're there. So if you're able to go from sort of monthly to daily sales data, it would be interesting to more closely tie these differences in types and quantity of liquor purchases more directly to these activity restrictions, or not. Maybe it is, this broader thing, and it's not about the specific activity restriction. I think that'd be interesting to explore if you're able to get more precise about it. A big thing was for me, these month fixed effects, because they seem to be substantial and separate from case rates and unemployment changes, which, we're generally thinking of as these big driving forces of the pandemic. So why are we seeing these big month fixed effects that aren't tied to what we think are these big drivers? And just things that you might want to explore are there any sort of state level measures from the health department that could maybe get to the county level of things that might be driving this, like survey-based measures of stress levels, pandemic fatigue, just like what might be driving that, and are there measures of that? Another possible explanation, we know there's big income boost from CARES Act relief. Is there any way to incorporate that into the model through things like county level estimates of eligibility or actual receipts of those benefits? I know there's been research, I think, by researchers at Columbia University that have put together monthly poverty estimates that showed poverty actually declined over the summer. So is there some way to sort of apply their methodology to the county level for Idaho to sort of proxy for the effect of those CARES Act benefits? But I think you have sort of the downward effect of increased unemployment. Is there some way to add into the model the potential upward impact of increases in employment or in income from these CARES Act relief measures? Is another possible explanation for that. Another question, retail sales remained elevated in rural but not urban areas into the summer. It's just very interesting finding. So just, is there anything different about rural areas' experiences with the pandemic that you would think would be driving this? It seems interesting because their case rates are generally lower, so sort of counterintuitive to what one might expect to see. Again, urban areas, you noted, were more affected than rural ones by COVID cases. So that sort of coefficient on the impact of the number of COVID cases was greater in urban areas than rural ones. I'm wondering, were there different restrictions put into place for these different areas that could be driving that? So I know in some areas, there were statewide restrictions put in place. Some places there were different restrictions for different areas depending on case rates. So, is there some of that going on? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But so that seemed like a potential driver for that finding. And then lastly, related to this, just something to consider is adding key takeaways related to policy and practice. So what does this mean for policymakers or others trying to support community needs? How should these inform government responses to future pandemics? Hopefully we don't have any coming anytime soon, but economic dislocations, overall liquor tax regulation, taxation or regulation, what does this tell us in terms of making decisions and actually regulating, taxing, or supporting community members and communities in these sorts of challenging times or otherwise. So moving on to the last paper, again, very interesting paper. Just a few reflections. The employment effects, you note that rural areas were more affected than urban areas, holding all other factors constant. And I think that's an important point because we know that those other factors aren't constant. There are persistent differences in the industrial and demographic profiles of rural and urban areas. And so to the degree that policies are targeted to either place or industry or demography, it's important to know what the distributional effects will be on places, and just a little bit of worry about sort of taking findings out of context and saying, oh, rural areas are more affected, and so direct a lot of support there, when in fact their industrial and demographic profiles have been held constant, and so you may be directing resources to places that, once those are not held constant, are actually less effective than other areas. So to the extent that this informs policy is something to keep in mind. Again, the finding around greater resilience for areas with higher shares of self-employed individuals, very consistent with past work by, for example, Anil Rupasinghe and others on the importance of local small business ownership. So it was good to see that further confirmed in this work. And just a few recommendations. So the greater share of the population with bachelor's degrees or higher being associated with larger employment loss in 2020 was certainly counterintuitive, as you noted. And you mentioned the potential connection with employment stimulating certain industries, but you were controlling for industrial composition in the model. So I think just a bit more exploration of what's going on there would be helpful. And one thing I noted was, is this correlated with COVID cases? So we know that places with more educated workers are spatially concentrated and tend to be spatially concentrated in more urban, more impacted areas, at least early on in the crisis. So is it possible that this may be actually correlated with something that could be driving some of this employment that's not actually related to the level of education? And lastly, and I'll stop here, a few more recommendations, just the factors associated with a percent change in business applications, I thought was a great contribution. I think it was table 5. The only thing, just consider adding in some measure of access to financial capital, wealth, or other means to support the creation of businesses, to see if those play a role. Just coming from a banking regulator, always just thinking about capital access, wealth, and those sorts of things. So are those a meaningful factor in deciding business application rates? Would be interesting to know. And then, as with asking around the last paper to think about policy recommendations, Your last paragraph notes the importance of understanding the factors that help one place do better than another in terms of thinking about its future and sort of adapting to the future. I just highly encourage you to extend the analysis to more fully explore what those factors are. And so the paper mostly looks at existing industrial and demographic composition and not the sort of institutional policy practices and supports that may be most likely to make a difference in whether a place adapts well to crises or not. And so what can we learn if we try to incorporate those sorts of things? You know, what is the most critical action that a place can take to help support the transition of those that are laid off or otherwise looking to start new businesses? Is there a way to measure entrepreneurial support, overall entrepreneurial culture, access to finance or accumulated wealth? Do any of these things matter, right? Sort of trying to get at that adaptability and support infrastructure in the community and figuring out whether those meaningfully change employment levels, likelihood to start new businesses, and adapt to the future of what the economy looks like. I think would make this an even greater contribution to the field and contribution to helping policymakers not only understand the effects, but how to effectively respond. So thanks so much again for letting me be a part of this, and great work on the papers.
Thank you, Andrew. And I didn't even need to tell you time because you were right on time. So good job on that. I want to open it up to any of the other authors. I'll defer to Phil and Steve if you want to make any comments, and also to attendees. If you have any questions for our presenters, please put them in the chat so we don't have people talking over each other. And then we can try to address any additional comments people might have on the research. Steve or Phil, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I could. Andrew, thank you very much for the very helpful comments. I was not aware of the Gallardo and Whitaker paper, so I'm really interested in digging that up and breaking that out. That gives us a couple of ideas on how to deal with our key dependent variable. The natural amenity spent, that's the Wisconsin bias in me, in that's something that we've been promoting as an economic development strategy is leave Chicago and flatland Illinois and move to the beautiful state of Wisconsin. So that's kind of my implicit bias on that. But the idea of bringing in arts and cultural things, I think that's a good idea. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Phil, there's a comment in the chat. If do you want to try to address that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate those comments. I think those are very good. I don't know about the daily data. I don't think that they would give that to me, but that's a good ask. And those other comments are spot on. I'll incorporate those into the paper as it goes forward. Dawn, your question, the scanner data. Yeah, so what we were really interested in initially was the health of food and how that changed, and especially looking at, so did people substitute less healthy food for more healthy food, or vice versa, or kind of maybe a broader study of kind of people working from home, because that's a broader trend than just COVID. COVID kind of exacerbated that. So that was our idea, and the scanner data, Jill kind of is in charge of that and wasn't able to get it in time. But I since we have the proof of our alcohol, I also am kind of interested in kind of seeing, did people high grade, did they low grade, what did they do? I started looking at that a little bit, and I haven't been able to find a giant effect that people went for higher proofs or anything like that. But that was, so the scanner data with the liquor data is supposed to be looking at kind of how, not only kind of the effects we talked about in this paper, but kind of the healthiness of the substitutions.
Well, and we're of course thinking about that too. And one of the things is that when you're looking at food away from home, of course, that's bundled into meals that you can't disentangle what product category to put them on. Whereas the food away from home, or food at home now, BLS and scanner data can help you sort better into categories. So I'd be interested in what you figure out for how to come about that challenge, because that's always been the problem with food away from home, is it's reported and aggregated in a way that it's hard to know exactly what the nutrient component parts are, right? So I didn't know that was the major focus, but that's interesting too. So thanks for answering.
Yeah, and Andrew, I want to thank you for your comments. There's definitely a couple of things in there that we need to think about, and this wasn't our final analysis, obviously, because we just got the more recent data, like December 15th or something like that. So we were still struggling with it, but those were very useful comments, and I appreciate your comments. I did have a comment, Phil. I can maybe give a comment. I want to sort of, even if you can't get the daily data, I would wonder if there is some sort of lagged response in what's happening. So, I mean, even if you could get maybe even weekly data, you might be able to capture that. But even with the month, if it's the previous months, someone might not change their behavior instantaneously, especially because you're using monthly data. So you won't know like when they're affected during that month. So one thing you might want to consider is just lagging a month, even if you can't go farther, even if you can't get more disaggregated than that, it might have some interesting implications. So we have about 10 minutes left, and if you haven't been in one of these sessions, it literally closes at 2:15. Poof, you're gone. So any other comments, questions? We have still a number of it.
This is Peyton Barrier. I'm not sure if the chat function is working. I just wanted to ask a question though on the issue of people moving to rural areas. As in light of the pandemic, I was just wondering how much you were tracking part-time versus full-time movements. I think, my guess would be people with vacation homes in the Poconos, they're going to want, they would be moving as a part-time telecommuter without actually committing to actually relocate. And I was just wondering how you're picking that up in the research.
I think that's what the percent of housing that is seasonal and occasional use is picking up. We have a lot of recreational housing in Wisconsin, and you do see a lot of folks that, they're basically snowbirds. They may not be of that age category, but they behave in that regard. They spend their summer months at their their summer cottage, and they telecommute, they work. And then during the hardest part of winter, unless you're really into winter sports, they go someplace else. The only problem is that we don't have, we have lots and lots of anecdotal evidence on that, but we don't have anything that is definitive that we could put into a regression analysis. So that's something that a lot of the communities in Wisconsin are looking at, is because they see this and they're saying, how can we take advantage of this and make this more of a year-round phenomenon? And that's that's driving a lot of the natural amenity kind of focus, because that's what's kind of getting a lot of these communities thinking this way. You're right though, moving into I'll pick on Central Illinois because I went to school at the University of Illinois. There's, unless you're from there and you're returning home, this is not a strategy for a lot of these low amenity type regions.
Yeah, my two quick thoughts on that was, first, this might create an even further, how would you say, rich get rich sort of dynamic where you have these high amenity places with natural attractions that become destinations for people who want to telework. My other quick take on that was factoring in this cost of living aspect of things. I work for the USDA, and cost of living adjustments tied to the location of work are, you know, that they're significant. So if you start to get into an environment where even now with COVID, we've had people relocate out to Colorado where they've gotten rental houses and they're putting their kids through teleschooling, and but they're still treated as DC workers for other purposes.
That's right, and I think what's driving a lot of the speculation in the popular press about the growth of telecommuting is what's happening in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. You're actually seeing such a large out movement. You're actually seeing rental prices in San Francisco going down, and it's because of the cost of living. People are being repelled away from these high cost of living regions. And they're moving into, well, places, it used to be Portland, Oregon, and now Portland's gotten into this, super expensive. It's become like a second San Francisco in terms of expensive housing. But you're right, that's a good point.
So there was an issue with the chat, so it's been fixed. So if you have any other questions, we've got about 5 minutes, again, before we all get sent away, poof, and we won't be here. Any other comments? I see, Phil, there's a comment for you. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm typing that right now. But yeah, so a great question. Thanks, Aaron. I do have data on religious adherence by whatever you'd call it. So I have LDS percent, Catholic, whatever, all the breakdowns. And the unfortunate part of that is that it's not time. It's not a time series. It's certainly not monthly. It's not even annual. I think it's decadal. And so I think it would be redundant to the store fixed effects. So I could take those out and see if any of those random effects like religion are a big player, it's a good question. I'll think about that.
But looking at Idaho, isn't that, I mean, kind of from an outsider looking in, I mean, it's Trump heaven, isn't it?
It is, although the urban Boise, Ada County, I think went for Biden. I think Blaine County, which had a lot of, which is where Sun Valley is, had a lot of the early cases of COVID, and it's also a Democratic stronghold. So that there's a few, yes, and I think we're the third most Republican state in the nation. So yes, in some sense.
So Phil,
I guess even that there is heterogeneity.
Phil, if you wanted to separately control for religion and take out your store fixed effects, you could also control for percent, 2016% vote of Trump, like we did in our model. And that would give you a separate effect from religion, which may be in some previous research that I've done about social attitudes, there is a difference between political and religious. And so you might be able to control for both if you wanted to try that type of a model.
Okay. Yeah, it might be good to do both. I mean, I'm not sure that's a hypothesis we were wanting to explore here, but maybe that would be interesting. You have a fixed effects and a random effects kind of paper.
It would help explain your fixed effect then. Right? I mean, it's being sucked up by your fixed effect now, but it would be sort of underlying the motivations for why there's these differences.
Heather, you got a question in the comments.
In the paper show. So the new business openings are filings for new, what are called high propensity business filings. So it means that there is a formula where they've developed that shows that certain types of business applications are more likely to become a new business, and they're available weekly at the state level. We are not able to disaggregate whether that filing is because people have no alternative, but we do control for weekly changes in unemployment, as well as COVID and some other factors, COVID cases, as well as some things about the underlying economic structure of the region. So we don't know about those individual people, but we can know something about the individual business climate. And there's one for you, Steve. You got 2 minutes before.
Dawn, I think the nomad comment, I think is right on target. I think you're going to see a lot of folks that are basically able to move with the weather and take advantage of that. And having spent the holidays down in New Orleans with my daughter, I can appreciate snowbirds now. And if you can telecommute, I think you're going to see that, particularly for higher income folks that have the wherewithal to be able to do that. Now that kind of goes back to the, I think it was Peyton's comment about, is this going to widen the, income divide? Perhaps, but I think it also creates employment opportunities for lower income workers, like that that single mom bookkeeper who is now able to actually work remotely because of childcare related issues. So I think there's an opportunity here in the short term. Who's going to take the most advantage of it? I think it's the higher income professionals. But I think the long-term opportunities here is, I think there.
Yeah, and Andrew, in Colorado, we saw people with kids. They figured out they could do the kids' school from home. You have to remember, a lot of states had school from home. So we saw really, really interesting dynamics in Colorado this year, and our rural towns didn't know exactly how to handle it. So you have someone come through with their RV, and your retail food stores even didn't have the right mix of stuff for what people were wanting to stock up and stuff. It's just going to be an entirely different rural development talk, I think, because I think there are some people looking at doing it, but I didn't know if, I don't even know where you start getting into the data on that. I just know it's something Colorado saw, and our rural communities are asking us about it, and we kind of don't know enough to say anything definitive. So something for us to look at in the future, for sure.
Dawn, quick before they cut us off, are you seeing a spatial difference between Western Colorado and Eastern Colorado?